Hey, welcome to the third day of JavaScript Funct-on-ions. Still having a problem saying that, but I'm going to continue to get used to saying that here over the next 30 days. I've taken the whole concept, and I think it does sound a bit corny, but it's really the concept that has given me the word to use, being that a lot of times there's the metaphor of being able to, take apart a problem is like peeling an onion. And so I looked at the word functions and I was like, you know what? I probably can slide that on in between the funct and then funct uns, funct uns, and put the on for funct onions. So that's the key concept for this 30 days, is to be able to look at the various aspects of functions and the different personalities that they can play in JavaScript. So the wording, you know what? I'm going to have to just work on saying it properly, and then get over the fact that it probably does sound weird. Anyways, this is the third day, and going to be going into working with binary functions. And yesterday we worked with our first unary function, and we're going to take that a level further and start to look at use of binary functions. Here I've had to add a couple functions that we're just going to be able to use with our lift-in binary. And pretty much all they do is they just have one responsibility, and one is to add and one is to multiply. And here we're going to start to really focus on this lift function. Now, this lift function, there's some people that might have come across this, seen it used before, but it's got some really good usages generically, and you'll see it in some libraries, you'll see it in some frameworks, and in different naming what's the word I'm looking for? Naming scenarios. But it's the ability to be able to bring multiple functions together, and and use one particular function to combine those values. So it can take a source, and then you're able to call in multiple times. Now, so what I'm showing you right now is, if you haven't seen us work with this before, I just introduced it yesterday, is that we've got the JavaScript engine running right now, and we've went ahead, and just to make sure is that we've got the red arrow that lets us know that this will be the next line that we execute. And as we go through these steps, we're going to also see a lesser opaque green line that's going to show the line that we just executed. At this point in time, so nothing has been executed. All that's been happened is that JavaScript has gone line by line, and it has stored in the global window, the execution context, the add mul lift-in, and right now we're at the add fn that is undefined. Some things you will take notice to is if this is confusion, is that the frames, which are in JavaScript, we consider them to be the call stack. And so currently right now we're in the global call stack, and that's the global execution context. And what we've done is that in the global, being the window, is that we've got access to add, mul, lift-in, and add fn identifiers. So what's happened so far is that add, it's storing right now the whole function, every bit of it. So that every lift fn, all of it. If you were to actually go into your console and type in this whole function, and then afterwards you were to type in add, without calling it, without the parentheses afterwards, JavaScript is going to send you back the whole function, all this. So right now, all we're really doing is we're just storing the whole function right now in the global. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to execute this line 17. And when we do so, it's now going to call liftfn because we know that we have the parentheses afterwards, the opening and closing. So that tells us that this is a callee. And so liftfn is going to get called, and then it's going to take us in to liftfn. And now, because we're in this function, we now have added a new execution context into our call stack. So if you've seen this in consoles, and you're probably familiar with the fact that liftfn is going to be on top of the global, but fortunately this doesn't work that way. Inside of liftfn at this point in time right now is that we've got one identifier, and that is fn. And fn is the parameter that was given an argument of add. And so what we have here is that we have got fn, which is a pointer to add. So, and when I say pointer, it's a reference. So we've got add, which we can identify by the name add, which we found in the global execution context namespace. So right now, all we're doing is add the function identifier in liftfn is pointing to the function add. Now, so right here, we're now going to be at a point to where we're going to hit a return statement inside of this function. And when we do so, it's going to return us a value, and it is going to be the whole function, f function x with a return function y, which returns the callee function fn, x, and y. Now, we know that in JavaScript, what happens with a function is that when a function returns that value that it returns, it then jumps back to where it was called from. So let's find what happens now when we go forward here, is that now we jump to line 18, and now we are calling add fn with 3. Now, what we have here is something that's particularly interesting, is that add fn actually returned us this whole function. So that was the value that was returned from it. So now what we can do is that we could see what happens that's going to help us to understand more of what's going on. So when we go back in now, we're into add fn, we're going to see something of particular interest, is that we still have a reference to this function identified as add. Now, how did we hold on to that? We hold on to it because there's that reference. And as long as there's a reference that's out there that's being held on to, is that that function will not go away. So liftfn, even though it was called and returned from, is that we still have a reference that's being held on to into the parent, which was the identifier fn, which we saw a couple steps ago. So now that we're inside of a new execution context, which is this return function, so we're still able to hold on to this identifier, which points to add. So what we're now looking at here is that we have got ourselves a new execution context. We've got a reference to the fn pointing to add, and now we've got x being the value 3. So when we called add fn, 3 was passed in to the parameter x, and that is what we currently have into our execution context. So now we're going to find another thing that happens interesting, is that now we're returning again from this function. So if we go forward again, the return value is again another function. So now we got to think to ourselves, okay, so we are not returning anything but a function. So when we go back to the place to where it was called, what is the value? Let's take a look. Okay, so we have completely cleared out that execution context, and we're back in the global. So where is it that we're able to actually get these values that we're looking for? Well, if we go as another step forward, is that now we're into the execution context of that returned value, which now we have a callee, which is fn, where we're actually passing in x and y. So if we look here in our new execution context, is that we're still holding on to references from our parent functions. And we're able to do so because of the references, because we did not let go of those references of what we had before, and we'll start to call those closures. Is that at this point in time is that we returned a whole function. So the value that was returned was the function itself. And when we did so is that we held on to a reference, because now we have got a reference to x here in this function. X is in the parent, and so we're still holding on to that value that we had from the parent, which is the number 3. Also, we have fn, which then outside of that, or the parent is then a grandparent. We're still holding on to a reference of add. So add, if we look at it, is a placeholder. So let me put it this way. Fn is passed in the function add, and we still have a reference to it. X was passed in the number 3, so we still have a reference to that. And now y is going to be passed in the number 5, and we still have a reference to that. So now we're going to actually call fn. And when we call fn, which is add, let's think of it that way, we're now going to call add, passing in x, which is 3, and y, which is 5. That is going to jump us up into the add function. Now we're into the execution context of add. And with add, we passed in a, which was x, which is 3, and b, which is 5. So now what our value is that we return is going to be 3 plus 5, and that's our return value. Now, so that there is going to pop off to get us, it's going to take us out of the add function because we returned the value. And now we're going back to where we were when we originally called it. And then we're going to be outside and we're going to be done with the add fn. So that gives you an idea of the concept of closures, is that in what we were able to do is that we were able to hold on to references as we went down from one parent into a child, and each step of the way we were able to hold on to values because of references. So even though that, you know what, this, let's just go back a step. Well, let's not even go into add yet. So when we're here inside of line 12, where we're about to call fn with x and y, is that inside of this context is that we have no x, we have no fn, we have y. But what is happening is that when we return this function from the 2 steps before, is that we still have the ability to look outside of this execution context and see what x was. And that is that when it was returned with the number 3. Just the same as that with fn, we don't have it in our local execution context, but we can go up, and what we'll find is we'll see that fn actually was assigned, and the assignment was a reference to add. So each step of the way is that we were able to hold on to those references and until we actually returned this call to add, passing in x, which we still have as 3, and y, which we're passing in as 5. So that this kind of gives you an idea of when you need to be able to hold on to values over time, with even if a function, a function expression or a declaration function, function declaration, however you want to say it, even when you return from a function, that thing goes both. How do you say it? Both? Boom. It's gone. It's a whoosh, not there anymore. But if we have references, then it has to stick around. So until we actually lose those references, JavaScript is not going to garbage collect. So as long as it sees that, with this fn, is that we still have fn being held on to, it's still going to be around, and it's still going to be pointing to this function that we've identified as add, and it could say, okay, you know what, I still need that. So let's push forward again a little bit. Here we just saw where we were able to jump in. We were returning the value. We went back to where we were when it was called, and then we're done with it. So now another use case of lift fn. Here we assigned it to a variable, and then that variable actually became the calling function. Now we're just calling lift fn, and we're just directly passing in the function that we want to use and then the parameters. So let's see how this operates. So here right now we're going to go in just as we did before, and it's really not going to be any different, but we're going to continue to watch and see how this actually gives us that closure to where we're able to remember remember the values that are returned from functions that then, should go boof, boom, out of the way, gone. So right now we've gone back in, and so we've got the function mul, which takes the place of this placeholder, I like to call them, of fn. So fn, it points to the mul function that's in the global. Now, all that's going to do is the return value from lift fn is just going to be this whole inner function. And so when we return from there, is that boom, we're out of lift fn. It's gone. So from that expectancy, this is that, okay, you know what, we don't have that value anymore. But we do, because what happens is that when we return that whole function, is that we're still holding on to that mul. I should have just called it multiply the with fn, because when we go into the next one, we'll see that fn is still needed. So we couldn't just say, okay, you know what, we're done with fn, because we still have a reference to it. And so when we've created this new execution context where we've now executed, I guess you could say we called lift fn, and we're still holding on to this reference of mul, and now we're executing it with the number 5. So that argument is going to be passed into x, and now x is going to be the number 5. And inside of this execution context, we're going to have a reference to fn, which is found in our parent function, lift fn. So it's really just a matter of holding on to a reference that allows us to hold on to that value. Because in this function here, we're going to see the same thing happened a few steps ago, is that when we go forward, all this return value is just another function, a full function. That's the return value, is the complete function. So when we do this, is that we're going to jump back down, and we're back down to lift fn on line 19. And so that whole execution context went away, and we're now back into the global. And now we have lift fn with our multiply, our 5, and now we're about to call it with the argument 6. So again, we go back in, And now we've got another execution context where we actually are passing in 6 into y. But you'll see here is that we're still now returning fn, passing in x and y. Well, we couldn't completely remove away fn, even though lift fn was no longer, because we still have ourselves a reference to fn. And so that is still pointing to the multiply, I'm just going to call it multiply, to the multiply function that's found in the global. And then at the same time, we still have our abilities to get the value of x because we still have a reference from x. So we don't have x in this current local execution context, but we do have it from the outside parent. So because we returned the whole function, we still know that we needed that reference to x. So we get to the point here to where now we're going to return this function and we're going to call it. So if we're calling it, we know that fn is multiply, and it is going to be called passing in x, which is 5, and y, which is 6. This is going to jump us inside of the multiply function, knowing that a is a placeholder for 5, b is a placeholder for 6. It creates that new execution context, and it is going to return a times b, which is 5 times 6, which our return value when we return out of multiply back to where we had originally called this from is going to be a return value of 30. So now once we jump back into it, we're back down and we're out of here and we've returned our value. So this is really just a concept of binary functions, of being able to use multiple functions to be able to hold on to references that are enclosed. Is that enclosed or declosed? That are outer. So we have outer parent functions, and it is going to look up the look up into the parent, and then look up into the parent until it finds that that reference. And it's going to go all the way up, and then if it can't find x into the global, then it's going to say, sorry, I can't find it. So that's a overview of using binary functions, which are going to help us because we're going to start to do more work with the other what was that word I used? Another personality of functions, and that is higher order functions. So we're just starting with these single responsibility functions like add and multiply, and now we got ourselves a binary function. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start to collect these functions, and each day we're going to start to find ways to where we can use these functions as a way to compose what it is that we're trying to identify. So we're trying to identify what it is that we want to be able to accomplish, and then we're going to be able to compose it in a way to where it's human readable and easier to comprehend. And we'll find out why that's important as we go each step of the way. So that's the and a wrap up of this one, and we'll continue moving forward using this lift fn along with the other functions that we use, to where each day we're going to find ourselves being able to compose more and more. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate it.